Welcome back to the Cycle World podcast. If you're already a listener and if this is your first one, welcome. I am Mark Hoyer, editor-in-chief of Cycle World, and I'm with Kevin Cameron, our longtime technical editor and a legendary transportation thinker. We always have a good time. Someone asked me about the origin of the podcast, like why did we start doing it? And I said, it's because typically I have a flannel shirt and I have ridiculous headphones, and that's what we do. We start podcasts when you have big headphones and a flannel. But in fact, Kevin and I would talk on the phone every week or more, sometimes less, and we would talk about lots of these kinds of topics, and new things would come out and we would talk about them. And I thought to myself, well, what if we just formalize this very slightly and figured out the technical difficulties of mounting a camera on a tripod and plugging it into a laptop?
Yep.
And here we are. Quickly approaching the 100th episode. Thank you for the support, everyone, and also our sponsors who have helped us out. Mecum Auctions, for one. They'll be back. We'll be doing a Mecum Auctions podcast on interesting motorcycles at the Las Vegas Motorcycle Auction happening in January. So stay tuned for stuff about that. But right now, before I start talking about all the troubles I'm having on my Ford 460 ignition system, because it's really on my mind. Let's talk about Norton Motorcycles. So we're going to talk about kind of the history of Norton Motorcycles, where they came from, and also what Kevin would describe as the Great Leap Forward, which I'll let him sort of kick us off there.
All right. Well, in our time, we're accustomed to what I would call the racing engine progression, which starts out with a mildly sporty street bike with a bore to stroke ratio of 1.3, meaning the bore is bigger than the stroke by a factor of 30%, so 1.3. And the people have at it in World Superbike and in the various national superbike series, such as AMA used to run. And before long, the manufacturers are saying, we're not winning. We know our motorcycle's the best one, and we certainly want to sell it. So the engineers say, well, we can rev it up. We'll see what we can do with cam profiles. And they do that for a while, and you can spend a lot of money with cam profiles. Oh, here's one, gives tremendous power, but it breaks valve springs. That is a story many times told. Vigorous acceleration, really send that valve open, and then at the right moment, close it just as the last whiff of intake velocity is crowding through the valve, which is almost on its seat. And I like to think about that. It's like people trying to make it into one of those closed sales. They're rushing for the door when the bell rings or the klaxon sounds.
So we got some interesting feedback from a viewer on YouTube when we were talking about exhaust systems, I think. And one of the comments was someone who was involved in drag racing. We were talking about blowdown, and that's what you're talking about here. Is it's the exhaust is rushing out, so you're hundreds of psi, 100 and something psi after the combustion event, and we've used the energy to push the piston down, and then you open the exhaust valve and poof, goes Auspuff, as the Germans say. Auspuff. Goes out, and then it, the waves go through the exhaust, and then you're hoping that there is that negative pressure that comes in and pulls more mixture in, as Kevin's describing. The drag race guys, this fellow said that at some very late timing, like they want to open the exhaust valve, but it's still 1500 psi in the cylinder. I thought, well, that's a different universe, isn't it? We don't have that going on at all.
Because the way they draw the curve of pressure versus volume, the amount wasted by opening exhaust port is just this little shading, like a little bit of territory down at the toe of the curve where the pressure is low and there's not a lot of energy. So the notion of trying to push the exhaust valve open at 1500 psi, That is a big load on the cam. So, and there's been more than one engine that has had all kinds of failures because of the trouble in a supercharged engine of shoving the exhaust valve open against a considerable residual pressure in the cylinder.
Well, how many times have you seen on drag race runs where the blower and the top of the engine just shoots skyward?
Yes. Don't want, but it is spectacular. Anyway, in that early time, the superbike era, they next say, "Oh, we'll shorten the stroke, and that way the piston acceleration will decrease, and we'll be able to rev up without um, reciprocating parts problems like piston cracking." Piston cracking is serious once you get into racing because you've got aluminum, which is prone to fatigue failure, and you've got temperature. And when you raise the temperature, all the little molecules are, they have almost enough energy to let go of their bonds one to another, ultimately initiating a crack.
Or at
And
least
so,
smudging a bit.
yep. But Norton followed a very different path because they faced a different limit. Their crankshafts, when they started going to the TT and trying to win it, let's say starting after World War I, 1920, they had 5-piece crankshafts that were pressed, tapered, keyed, and nutted together. It was a sort of a cross your fingers, folks, because we don't want any of these many joints, 4 of them, to slip. And indeed, when Honda got to the end of their classic era of racing in the later 1960s, their big 500, the RC 181 that was ridden by Mike Halewood, did have some crankshaft slippage problems. But what this effectively did was RPM was rising fairly briskly in 1920, 25. By the time they got to 1930, they're running at 5,000 RPM. When they got to 6,000 or 6,500, maybe we ought to cool it a little bit there. So what we see in the case of Norton's development is, instead of bigger bores for bigger valves, shorter strokes for reduced piston acceleration, because these modern industrial motorcycle manufacturers don't think too much about retooling for a completely different engine. At least they didn't in that superbike era. So suddenly they're kind of RPM limited. Here is the basic fact. In 1908, when Pa Norton, as he is often referred to, decided to give his big single a 79 by 100 millimeter bore and stroke, how could he know that that bore and stroke would remain constant, including the racing engines, the racing singles, which were so refined and so developed by Joe Craig, who was their racing director, that bore and stroke would remain unchanged until 1951. Well, what did they do? They discovered the miracle of valve overlap, for one thing. They discovered late intake valve closure. They discovered, oh, this fuel doesn't knock like last year's fuel. We should raise the compression ratio. So as fuel octane was improving in the late 20s, compression ratio was going up. And the rule of thumb from the engineers is that peak combustion pressure is like 100 times the compression ratio. So if you're starting out in 1920 with 4.5 to 1, 5 to 1, that's not a lot of combustion pressure. Yes, the pistons are they're receiving some energy, but not as much as they could if it was 10 to 1. So compression ratio is rising. And in those early days, as I said, RPM is rising. So it's performing more power producing cycles per minute. That's RPM, pretty much. Of course, you have to divide it by 2 because a 4-stroke requires 2 revolutions to complete its cycle. But what they were doing was they were refining everything about that 79 by 100 engine. In 1927 or so, Harry Westlake in England wondered why the 3 Sunbeam race engines that he'd bought all had different horsepower. One had 25, one had 26, one of them had 29. Why can't they all be like that? So he thought about it and he decided maybe it's harder in some engines for the airflow to get into the combustion chamber, to get it to fill the cylinder. So he built this thing to measure airflow, and son of a gun, it was true. The airflow capacity of the poor performing engines, the 25 and the 26 horsepower ones, was notably less than in the 29 horsepower case. So he had a business. I'll fix your lousy engine and make it outstanding. And about the same time at the U.S. Army's Air Development Center, McCook Field in Dayton, Ohio, near where the Air Force Museum now is, at Wright Field. It's out of town, but it's nearby. They started measuring engine airflow. So suddenly they could actually make changes, find out what they were going to do, and guide their work by means of actual measurements rather than, well, this port looks pretty good. So,
Yeah, that's the parts canon. You know, when you're trying to diagnose a problem, you know, there's
yes.
a lot of ways of doing that. You might buy an oscilloscope and check for the square waves of the pickup, or you know, if the ignition's breaking up, or you know, you just buy a lot of parts and keep bolting them on.
Try A,
It's
try B.
it's great to have actual data and measure things before you
Yep.
make decisions. Look at that science.
So they are they gave up side valve. In a side valve engine, the valves are beside the cylinder with their stems pointing down, so the air goes up to the valve and out of the valve and across a little compartment where the valves are, and then down into the cylinder. So the air is, if it doesn't have a map, it could get lost. Side valves did not have good airflow. But overhead valve engines, how are we going to lubricate it? I know, oil can. And the early overhead valve engines from all those British manufacturers, that's what you did. You brought an oil can or a dab of grease. And where did the oil go when it flew off of those busy rocker arms? On your pants, on your shirt. That wasn't popular. So all these changes are boosting power. And soon an iron head and an iron cylinder were running too hot. They ran into the dreaded, in the earliest days, they called it misfiring, meaning it's not firing the way we want it to. It wasn't misfiring like intermittent firing. It was bad firing. So they realized that the engine wasn't cooling very well, so they made the head out of bronze, hard enough to seat valves on, about double the conductivity, heat conductivity, lower operating temperature. That era didn't last long at all.
It was a nice looking cylinder head, though.
Oh, lovely thing to see those.
Bronze heads are they're gorgeous. There's one.
They
my
are.
friend's got one on a 40 Triumph bronze head, racing head of the day.
Great stuff. This is
it's like when you get a really high quality valve spring and you can just see the sheen and the nickel in it.
Yes.
It's so good. You can just.
You won't see it at the Guggenheim. But it is art
Yeah.
because it inspires emotion. Anyway, meanwhile they're sitting there at 6,500 RPM or so, and they're doing all these changes, and the overhead valve engine riders in the TT had to carry a couple of push rods down their boot top on one side and a valve depressor down the top of the other boot, because clang, a push rod would pop out, no problem, stop, pull out a fresh push rod, stick your tool in, good as new, push off, we're racing again. And Norton decided with their Model 18, which was a push rod and rocker,
Really great motorcycle. I rode a 46. Really just,
single cylinder,
yeah.
why won't it win the TT? So they're asking around, and somebody said, why don't you call Walter Moore? He kind of, that's how he makes his living. He goes to these different companies and says, oh, you got a gearbox problem? I'll design one for you. Hear about that. That'll be 1995. And so they called him in, and he said, what would you win with? Look at your motorcycle's a mess. It has a rim, a brake block and dummy rim brake on the rear. It has this flopping single plane bicycle frame where the stays going to the rear axle are attached to the seat post. So it is relatively easy for the whole rear wheel assembly to swing from side to side, merrily steering the motorcycle without your permission. Now, in those days, the riders called this poor steering.
Yeah.
So they said, well, you're hired. And so Walter Moore goes shopping, and he comes back with 40 Model T brake drums. And he directs the prototype guys how to lace these things, modify them to lace into a Norton rear wheel. Wire spokes. What else? And he's looking at the frame, and he's thinking to himself, I'm going to run the rear axle stays on the bottom forward under the engine into a Y-shaped casting, the epsilon frame, if you will. And this Y-shaped thing in the front, it will join to a single down tube coming from the steering head. And it put a stop to that self-steering. And one rider said, just that difference in the frame is worth 10 miles an hour to me. And because think of what sabotage it is if your motorcycle has one idea about where you should go and you have another. And every corner, you having to have this discussion over again. Let's quiet down that action. So I used to think that it was Howard Davies, the HRD in Vincent HRD. Howard Davies in 1924 produced a frame like this, but Walter Moore had already built one for the Model 18. And they were off and running. They began to win races. And at last they had some guidance, because this was an era in which the tendency was, let's soup up the engine. Who needs brakes? Who needs a chassis? Who needs reliability? Well, we all do. So this thing was successful. Mind you, still 79 by 100. And in 1927, Walter Moore designed a single overhead camshaft head for the Model 18 bottom end.
Hey, CS1.
Yes, the CS1, camshaft 1. And this was intended to solve the toss push rods unintended excessive valve valve train clearance, that is valve float. Problems, because it eliminates the rocker arm, it eliminates the push rod, so the spring is only having to move the valve 1/3 of the spring, the retainer,
Instead of the entire push rod,
instead of
all the way
that
down.
all that apparatus. Now,
Yeah.
I don't want to step on the toes of people who cherish and worship at the feet of pushrod and rocker engines. Some wonderful things have been accomplished in this way, not only in an engineering sense, but also in persuading the public that this is cool, which is contrary to fact.
Yeah, I mean, 2-valve pushrod, two of the greatest examples would be, for me, Norton Commando.
Yep.
Incredible combustion chamber and great flow, 28 degrees of spark, maximum spark lead, which is meaning the combustion chamber is working great. And the Harley Davidson XR750, a paragon of flow and swirl and filling.
Yes, because it never stopped being developed. Yeah. One of the things that's not obvious when you look at the old XR is that during its lifetime, the stiffness of its valve train was doubled. And this is the key to making push rods and rockers work quite well. Anyway, there's an old story about how Moore, with the one overhead cam engine that was finished, had to rent a tugboat for the price of a new motorcycle to take him across to the Isle of Man. And Stanley Wood says, "What baloney? I had that engine in Germany. It was running all over the place. That's public relations." What fun! Nonsense was going on even back in 1926, 27. So I'm going to leave off with the development of the Norton single-cylinder racer, because it went from single overhead cam to double overhead cam, still 79 by 100, until 1951, which is when suddenly the coming of the featherbed frame designed by the two Irishmen, using actual experimentation to develop the frame. They weren't stylists. Suddenly, with this new frame and with the 50-odd horsepower that this long string of development had produced, it was competitive. It was more than competitive with Gilera's inline 4-cylinder. Pretty good stuff, I'd say. So, for 4 years, they enlarged the bore and shortened the stroke every year on the factory engines. They were getting sincere. They were far-seeing persons, could imagine the superbike future. So now we have to step off of this trail and take up a completely different orientation to motorcycle development, which is when World War II ended, Britain, having participated in 2 world wars, had, in the scorekeeping sense, won in World War I and World War II, but in the financial sense, they lost their fundament. They were deeply in debt in 1945, and the government was just scrabbling around. What can we export to get hard currency? Turns out England's 2 big exports at that time were whiskey and motorcycles. It's
cue the wild one.
Yeah, you got it. And so the Board of Trade, which supposedly at that time had its own security and intelligence service that was very good at finding out things about German manufacturing or Italian manufacturing, etc., they announced that British motorcycles going back into production for the um, civilian market, 70% of production had to be exported. Well, Norton were famous for making singles. That's what they had made the whole time. Their whole history was singles. Some of them were sporting, most of them were just thudding, get to work specials. Um, so that wasn't going to sell in the USA. Remember that when World War II ended, people in the USA had nothing to buy during 4 years. So they kept that money. They stored it away. No products, no spending. When the war ended, they wanted to have fun. They wanted
Products.
to buy houses and cars and motorcycles. So that meant Norton needed a twin because Edward Turner in 1937 had designed the Triumph Speed Twin, which was the 500, making 26 horsepower, had a different sound. It accelerated well. Americans were accustomed to a different sort of motorcycle, quite portly, making a similar amount of power to the English product, but having to move a lot more avoirdupois. The motorcycles were chubby. So English motorcycles, particularly the Triumph Twins, sold well in the U.S. Norton needed some of that action.
You made a great point in a recent podcast about Honda, the CB350, that's been posted not long ago, about winning the war in English factories and technology.
Oh, that was Hopwood made that point. Yeah.
Yeah, and that Japan, it's hard to call it an advantage, but Japan and Germany both had nothing to start.
They
They
were
had none of that
flat.
old stuff. Yeah, I mean, think about the amount of bombing that took place in Germany.
Both
And
nations suffered the loss of their 66 largest cities.
yeah, I mean, just tragic waste. I
Yeah.
mean, God. But as you said, and as Hopwood said, they're starting. They're not shackled by what already was. They're allowed to say, rethink. How do we do this? And how do we?
Start afresh.
Yeah, brand new.
And he was thinking of Germany, but it actually turned out that it was Japan that was the danger. So what Hopwood was saying was, the Germans have nothing. When they re-enter commerce, they're going to do it with the latest designs and the latest manufacturing technology. And Hopwood had good reason to know that Norton, Triumph, BSA, etc., were still not using actual production lines. It was informal manufacturing. What will happen if Germany manufactures motorcycles on production lines, motorcycles with up-to-date design? Well, they'll wipe us out. We need new product across the board from 125 to 750. Well, of course, that wasn't going to go over with management because stockholders want their share. And so that meant no reinvestment, no production lines, no new manufacturing equipment. We know how to do it anyway. We'll just carry on regardless. And so Hopwood wrote a book about this called Whatever Happened to the British Motorcycle Industry. But he has his critics who say that he was utterly unable to deal with criticism, that he had ideas that he was unable to let go of. And isn't this the way of it? If someone asks your wife about you, is she going to report the same qualities and lackings that you would? No, everyone's got an opinion. So I'm just mentioning this because we can't take everything that Hopwood says as gospel, but he was someone who recorded his thoughts on the matter, so we consider them here. Anyway, Norton's got to come up with a twin, and this fellow Hopwood had been sharpening pencils for Edward Turner for years. That cannot have been easy because neither man was a easy personality to get on with. But they bring him in, and they're building a new factory, and they're I think he's working in a hallway or in a boot closet at various times before the actual drafting apparatus and so forth appears. But he designs a twin for Norton to export. And the central thrust of this design was not so much manufacturing convenience, like the Japanese engines open like a clam and all the parts are set into their little places. All the little grooves fit the little snap rings and the ball bearings, and everything just clicks into place. What he was concerned about was what he had learned while he was at Triumph, because the Speed Twin was not strictly the first of its kind. There had been a motorcycle called the 6-1 before it, but when Turner arrived, he said, "Get rid of that. That's scrap all that stuff. We're not doing that." He was brilliant at making something simple that appealed to the market. But if someone said, "Well, I'll do some calculations and come up with the diameter of valve spring wire that we'll need," he said, "That's for calculations? That's for schoolboys. Haven't you outgrown that?" So any effort by Hopwood to optimize things ahead of time was opposed. Anyway, what Hopwood had seen was that the Triumph Speed Twin, when worked hard, overheated and had poor exhaust valve durability and might detonate even on the very low compression ratios of that time, which were 6-1, 6.5-1. The fuel wasn't all that great either, because England during the war, people could see the gasoline, but they weren't allowed to buy it. It came in these great white tank trucks with red lettering that said, what did it say? Pool, meaning this is the gasoline that the refineries have pooled together to make some nasty stuff that the post office and the military can use to drive around the public roads. Pool petrol, 72 octane.
Oof.
You can hear it knocking in the can, as I like to say. So Hopwood was determined to overcome the shortcomings of the Speed Twin. The first thing that he saw was that the Triumph had two rocker boxes transverse across the head. The exhaust rocker box in the front, there was a camshaft directly under it, the intake rocker box behind the cylinder, and they were like fences, preventing cooling air from what you might call systematic circulation through the cooling fins that were located directly over the combustion chambers between these rocker boxes. So you can imagine building ductwork. If this were an aircraft engine, there would be ductwork that would feed it down into one side of those fins, would cross the head and then come up the other side, and there would be a pressure difference across the ducting to ensure that the cooling air moved swiftly on its way.
Oh yeah, big deal. All that stuff. The big radials. I mean,
Yes.
the path.
So much sheet metal on those
All
engines.
that, and even just the simple stuff, the flat 4s and the flat 6s on your, Grumman Tigers, your 0300s and all that.
Yep.
Yeah, it goes in the front behind the prop, and then there's all this hard ducting with silicone, usually now silicone flaps,
Yep.
sealing against everything to force it all straight down the bottom and then
Through the fin space.
through the fin space.
It doesn't just blow on the engine like it was a warm fence post.
Yeah.
So he's going to get rid of that. How's he going to do it? Well, in the old days, the first days of overhead valve, the rocker shafts were mounted on standoffs on top of the head, and they're up there in the air, chittering back and forth, and the cooling air was free to pass through the fore and aft fins on the head. Wonderful cooling. But people didn't like ruining their pants and shirts with the oil thrown off by unenclosed valve gear. So enclosed valve gear became a very important feature to have. So that meant that you weren't going to build an enclosed rocker box mounted on standoffs and then connect pressure oil to it with an external line and a drain back. All those parts, more cost. So they cast the rocker boxes as part of the cylinder head. Good solution on one basis, not so good on another basis. So here's what Hopwood did. If you look down on the Triumph cylinder head, you will see the two pairs of valve stems, intake and exhaust for each cylinder. You look down on it, and there, fore and aft, the plane down through the valve stems is parallel to the central plane of the motorcycle. He rotated those planes apart a considerable amount, like 25 degrees per side, and broke the front rocker box into two separate exhaust rocker boxes. In the space thus created, air was able to flow directly into the fins, which went from that opening in the front between the intake and exhaust rocker boxes on that side of the cylinder head and out, which meant direct path cooling. As long as the motorcycle was moving or there was a wind, air would be moving through those fins. The next thing that he did was he had obviously sat and looked at the Triumph cylinder head. It had a 90-degree angle between its valves because it had a deep hemispherical combustion chamber. Well, he'd had geometry class, and he knew that a hemisphere has double the surface area of a disc having the same diameter. So that
We should talk. Yep. Go finish your thought.
what this did was it provided large amounts of surface area in the combustion chamber through which heat could leave the hot combustion gas and cause the cylinder head to heat up.
And the engine to make less power because the heat, you want the heat to stay in the chamber, not to go running
elsewhere.
Yep. Where it's not doing the work that you want it to do. It's just turning into melting your stuff. I just want to pause for a second and say the combustion chambers we have now, the valve stems are typically parallel, vertical, practically vertical in the cylinder, maybe a little bit of kick. And then the combustion chamber, the piston is almost as flat as it can be. It will have a band around the outside for squish. You know, a modern piston is going to look like this one here, quite flat. Some cutouts for the valves.
No dome.
No dome. And the chamber is going to be like right on top of it.
Yep.
Whereas here, this is typical British hemispherical combustion chamber. And then this is from a Jaguar, which is like 35 and 40 degrees. So the valves are set and they open this way into the cylinder to trying to get a bigger area.
Yep.
And then having that great big dome. And boy, if you want an engine that knocks, it's a 3.8 liter Jaguar at 1800 RPM. Like 100 octane? No, it won't. But 93, it might.
Yeah.
It's really challenging. Anyway, carry on.
Yep. So, uh, why was this wide valve angle adopted in the first place? I think what happened was around in the early 20s, design team at Fiat was developing a Formula One engine. And I think they did some flow testing because somehow they discovered that the flow coefficient, that is the specific flow, cubic feet per minute per square inch of valve head area. This allows you to compare engines with different size valves in terms of specific flow. They found that the flow through a single intake valve into a combustion chamber that was a hemisphere or curved like a hemisphere was better than the flow from two intake valves in a 4-valve head located on the flat surfaces of the pent roof combustion chamber. So they said, well, let's give that a whirl. Well, we can't fit valves big enough in there. Well, if the stems are like this and you have a small bore engine, the valves are going to be small as well. So let's tip the valves apart so that they form a sort of tent-like affair over the piston, and there's more room in that diagonal than there is straight across the piston. So tipping the stems widely apart allowed the valves in a 2-valve engine to be larger. Well, when Hopwood reduced valve size, didn't he choke his engine off? No, because in the late 20s, airflow studies had shown that you didn't need valves that big. And as the design of valves and ports improved steadily, the size required for an engine didn't grow rapidly. So Hopwood said, look at those Gootsies. They've got a 58-degree valve included angle. Works for them. So he adopted that. This made the Hemi chamber shallower and of reduced surface area, so that it did not pick up as much heat from the hot combustion gas. And with a shallower chamber, as compression ratios were beginning to rise as pool petrol was replaced by something better, I think 80 octane was the first step, the piston crown could be flat. No big dome to increase the heat flow into the piston. Pistons are hard to cool. So a flat top piston was a blessing. And the last thing that he did was he did not follow in the train of smaller strokes and larger bores, because he knew that heat loss from combustion gas was proportional to combustion chamber surface area. A small bore and a long stroke, good, low heat loss, faster combustion because the flame doesn't have to go as far. They made some experiments at American Honda with 3 different strokes on one of their superbike engines. And as they reduced the bore size, the ignition timing required for best torque became smaller and smaller. The next thing that Hopwood did was he offset the intake ports as they had been offset on successful British racing engines such as the Norton Manx. By offsetting the port, you cause the flow to circulate in the cylinder.
Just as you play with the hose in a bucket. That's
yes,
your favorite. Because if you aim the hose at the side, it goes whew, and it just has all
yes,
kinds of velocity. And and turbulence.
And you're
Wonderful.
standing there waiting for this bucket to fill, which is not the most satisfying activity. So you play a little. This is called learning. Nobody teaches you this. You see it. So
combustion chamber, you're talking about lighting, making the bore really big. So if we have 115 millimeter, 116 millimeter bore, the fire, even if in a perfectly flat chamber, the distance it has to go, if you light it over here, or even if you light it in the middle, it's got a long way to go.
yes,
If you have a Hemi, not only is there more surface area, but if you light it over here, the flame has to travel over the mountain and get to the other side. It's a longer distance. It's like twice as far.
yep.
And that's why in a lot of these Hemis, like a second spark plug, they'll take one of these tiny Ducati spark plugs and stick it on the other side of the chamber. Ducati big bore superbike stuff, 2 plugs. Harley Davidson, we don't talk about how big the bore is in a Harley Davidson, but those 131s, man, that's a 4-inch bore.
Yeah.
Put 2 plugs in each one of those things, because you can light the fire in 2 places, and the overall distance that the flame has to travel is shorter, meaning your timing can be shorter, or you shrink the bore, as you were talking about with Honda.
Now,
And just
one fellow said, an engineer once said to me, I don't see that it makes much difference if my engine makes best torque at 40 BTDC. 40 degrees of ignition, you should be ashamed of yourself. Because for 40 degrees before and roughly 40 degrees after, the molecules are beating hard against the piston crown and the inside of the combustion chamber. And they are transferring that energy to those molecules. This is called heat flow. These molecules come up, pow! They set that molecule vibrating. It's bonded to all the atoms around it. That motion is transmitted to them through the bonds. This vibration is temperature. That's what temperature is molecular energy. So, by shortening the combustion time, Hopwood shortened the heat loss time. So now we've got his other bugaboo, which was he thought of the Triumph as a rattler. He said the front and the rear cams, there's 2 cam drives in there, and they both rattle because they're gears. He drove his cam, which was in front of the cylinder, through a chain. And instead of having separate pushrod tubes that had to be fitted in and make sure that the seals don't pop out of the little recesses at the end, it was cast into the cylinder. You put the cylinder on, and then you put the pushrods down in there and made sure that they were seated in the tappets. And then you could deal with the cylinder head. So he was able to quiet the engine in that way, just because he wanted to. Norton rewarded him by firing him in about 18 months because people were claiming that the engines were short-lived and they didn't do this and they didn't do that. The engines did an outstanding job for Norton for 30 years. And although they did increase the displacement, they kept close to the original small bore, long stroke formula. Now, there is this belief that will not die, so I don't bother trying to inveigh against it too much, that long strokes make torque. It just stands to reason. If you've got a longer lever, you're going to be able to, that's why an extension bar on your wrench, if it doesn't wreck the wrench, increases your leverage in tightening or loosening the fastener. So what you find if you do the arithmetic is, if we have, say, a 500 and this engine, which was called Dominator or Model 7 to begin with, it was a 500. So if you're choosing a bore to stroke ratio, each time you make the stroke longer, the bore has to get smaller to keep the engine at 500 cc's, and the pressure, the area of action for gas pressure on the piston decreases at exactly the same rate that the stroke increases. So there is no numerical advantage. The reason why we associate high torque with small bore long stroke engines is they have small valves. Valves have a range of velocities in which they do their best cylinder filling. Too fast, and you're tending to have sonic velocity and shock formation and so on. And this is going to reduce the flow. Too low, and the piston coming up as the valve is closing is going to not only stop the inflow of mixture, but push some back into the intake port. We've discussed this before. So there is no mathematical reason that a long stroke engine should do better than one, should produce more torque than one with the shorter stroke, but the same displacement. The reason that the long stroke engines seem to have good torque is that they have smaller valves, and their torque, their peak delivery occurs down at lower revs. And this has been the reason why, from start to finish, those Norton twins have been noted for strong mid-range. They have located the RPM of best cylinder filling in a range that people actually use when they're riding.
I'll tell you what, a Norton 850 Commando, 77 by 89 millimeters or 828 cc's, third gear, about 3,000 RPM, is a thing of beauty. You roll into that, you appreciate a 28-degree maximum ignition timing, all in, as we would say.
All in, yes.
It is a happy engine. I mean, it's vibrating its guts out. Thank goodness for isoelastics, as every time they kick that displacement up, it just started shaking the stuff more. But I think what you're talking about on the intake air velocity is so interesting. For me, what's engaging about the notion is that air has mass, and that
Certainly.
velocity, and that velocity, when you make the port smaller, because that's all that fits in that smaller bore, longer stroke engine, the mass of the air coming in at high velocity fills, and you can have cam timing that won't be able to counteract that and push it back out, as you said. As you know, I like my analogy for flow and diameter is take a straw and blow in the straw as hard as you can, and how much air comes out. And then take your garden hose or get your shop vac tube and blow as hard as you can. You barely feel it on the other end of that.
Yep.
4-inch hose. And that is one of the differences. There's an optimal airflow.
Because of this, the air has inertia. So when the piston starts to move down on the intake stroke, the air in the intake pipe is sort of. Do you feel the pressure somewhere? Is that something? Oh yeah, people are heading for the exit. It takes time for that mass of air to accelerate. So the piston has gone some distance before the air motion begins to catch up. So most of the cylinder filling occurs toward the end of the valve period. And if you have late closing, not an awful lot, so that you've got built a peaky monster, but enough to take advantage of all that air velocity around bottom center, that relatively high velocity through smallish valves will continue to crowd its way into the cylinder even as the valve is closing. So that's a wonderful thing. Now, Mark mentioned 28 degrees. The very first, the 500 Norton Twin, as Hopwood first conceived it, its timing for best torque was somewhere between 28 and 31. So it was there from the beginning. Amazing. It was there at the end, and people enjoyed it throughout those 30 years. And now as they're collector's items.
Brother, the team's getting thirsty here, but I'm going to bring up Velocette because That was a square bore and stroke, the 500, 86 by 86, and it's a hemispherical chamber. I don't know what the valve angle is between the stems, but it's
Yep.
quite wide. And when you're setting that up, if you read the books, they want 38. That's 10 more degrees of lead. So you're lighting it so early because it takes that long to build the peak pressure for after top dead center when the piston's in the ideal position, which is what, 17 degrees or something?
11, something like that. It's when
Yeah,
it
11
really
to,
starts to move rather than just, here I am on the hilltop. It's a nice
right.
broad
Well, think about the dead
before it.
stop at the top. The
Yeah.
piston comes up and the rod is swinging. And then in that last bit of area, the piston is at top dead center. It's barely moving.
The rod is straight up. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the rod goes straight and it comes to a complete stop. And then it starts to go, okay, we're going. And by the time you're out here, the lever is working and the piston is accelerating. And this is the area where you want to go peak pressure. So if you have a great chamber, you can light it 28 degrees before that. That's before top dead center, so it'd be 38 degrees before you wanted the peak pressure. But it'd be 48 degrees on the Velicette, which I struggle with knock. And then I only time it, say for modern gas, I time it for 35.
Yeah.
Because that's all I can get away with what we have at the pump here, 91 at the pump. If you put race gas in it, or cheater gas, as my friends on the Velicette rally would call it, you can rev with impunity. You can set the timing with impunity and just get whatever maximum torque you want out of it. But I have to say, from the entire time I owned that Norton Commando, using both a mechanical ignition advance, weights before they wore out, and then using an electronic ignition called a tri-spark, I don't think I ever had detonation in my Norton Commando.
Yeah.
And what a freeing thing that is, to not have to hassle with it or figure out what to do with the ignition timing, because it's just good.
Yeah.
Imagine.
Well, they told people who were operating the Norton factory racers that no operation below 3,500. Because for a racing engine, you set the compression ratio so that you are on detonation's doormat. You're very close, because otherwise you're leaving some pressure on the table. Remember, peak pressure is something like 100 times the compression ratio. So this is a lovely story, because I was this morning looking at a cross section of one of the Norton twin heads. It has 15 degrees of intake downdraft. Now, that was something that Norton crept up on in the development of their racer. Originally, there was no downdraft at all. And then they had a little, then they had 12, then they had 15. They ended up with 24 because they found that the steeper the downdraft angle, the less charge was lost during overlap, the time when both valves are open, briefly, a small amount. Lost out the exhaust, because the exhaust, there's that low pressure wave that is trying to aspirate exhaust residuals out of the combustion chamber. The intake valve is slightly open, and you don't want to aim the intake flow at the exhaust port. So that's why downdraft became an important thing. And the port that's pictured in that cross section is unremarkable. It's smooth. The curves, the short side of the port is smoothly curved. The downdraft angle is not extreme. In the early 90s, Kawasaki was using 45 degrees of downdraft. I believe the Cosworth people played around 30 to 35. It's there's a lot of stuff that was pioneered in those original Norton racing engines, and there was a lot of careful thought by Hopwood on how to avoid the problems of overheating with an air-cooled engine. The basic problem of an air-cooled engine is going to run hot on a hot day and colder on a cold day. If it's cold enough, it won't vaporize all of its fuel and it'll be lean. So air-cooleds have some special problems, and I think Bert Hopwood applied himself in an effective way to solve many of them, or at least to keep them at bay. By the way, contemporary engines, British twins, were needing 36, 38 degrees. In the 1930s, some of those overhead valve engines were requiring 42 degrees. So to fire at 28 degrees is a wonderful accomplishment. It's very close to the number that Dick O'Brien had achieved with their Battle of the Twins bike, which was 27.
Dick O'Brien's a longtime racing manager, director guy at Harley Davidson.
Harley Davidson.
Legendary.
57
legendary,
to 84.
Yeah.
And a man of salty speech.
Very salty speech. And in his retirement, I interviewed him. Well, his air quote retirement, I interviewed him when he was in Florida. And that was my contact with him, a phone interview. I called him and I got all the punctuation that he used,
Yes.
with F-bombs and S-bombs and all of that. And they were just, everybody was still, he said, I'm trying to fucking retire and this and that, and fucking and send me the goddamn, on and on. And They were sending him cylinder heads. They were sending Dick O'Brien NASCAR cylinder heads and sprint car cylinder heads for him to do porting and chamber work. In his retirement in Florida, they were mailing him stuff, and he was getting it done.
So-called
retirement. It was wonderful to talk to him. Very special.
I visited him before he went south, and he described how he spent the war, World War II. He was with a unit whose job was to restore to flight status captured enemy aircraft, usually shot down, or ran out of fuel and landed in a field.
Have I ever heard a vocation I want to do more? Dang it. I missed my calling.
So what they were doing there was, as quickly as possible, restoring these aircraft to flight status so that test pilots could ascertain their strong and weak points so that Allied pilots could understand what they were up against before they were up against it. And he said, nobody wore a shirt if it was hot. Nobody buttoned a button. He said, nobody polished anything. He said, then the war ended and we got a new CO, and he said we were unsoldierly. Well, there were a lot of guys at Pratt & Whitney who tried to enlist, but they weren't allowed to because Materiel Command said these are essential people in essential occupations. If you're developing superior versions of the R2800 radial, you're doing better than if you're stopping bullets out in a muddy field. And so it was with these men readying captured enemy aircraft for flight test. And so he said, all the best guys left, and the ones who didn't want anything but a paycheck stayed where they were. But he said it was fun while it lasted. He described one engine that was remarkably free of valve float. And he said, we looked at that thing all different ways. And he said, finally, we crack tested the rocker arms, and one of them had a little crack coming. And he said, I'm thinking the extra flexibility of that just happened to fit with something that was going on in the valve train, because he said it was very different, that one.
It's interesting the way that vibrations and all the hertz can stack for or against you.
Yeah.
Crank vibrations, having crank dampers, or changing an aircraft from a wood prop
To a
to a
metal.
metal one.
Yeah.
The Stinson uses a 165 horsepower engine, 6-cylinder, and on a wood prop you can kind of fly it however you want, but with a metal prop there's a band of RPM like 2800 to 3. I don't know what the specifics are, but it says don't run here.
No fly zones.
Don't run here.
Yeah.
You can pass through it to go up to peak power, and you can run below it, but don't run at there. I've had I rode several test bikes home, and there was a section of road that was under construction. The road wasn't under construction. There were houses under construction, and they had cut trenches, and they cut these trenches at a gap, right? There's a series of these trenches, and every motorcycle I rode over those bumps lost it. Yeah. Not one could cope, because there was something about the cycle of those impressions on the suspension.
The frequency of the suspension, yeah.
Yeah, it made everything horrible for that brief moment. For the 2.5 seconds I was going, grrr, the bike just, it was gone. The suspension was like, I don't know what to do. And the bike would go, and then it was back. It was fascinating. I should have measured that and then calculated my speed and made that part of
you spoke of vibration in regard to Commando and 850. Doug Heel took over from Joe Craig development of the Manx, and they continued toward shorter strokes, and I think he got as far as 93 by 70 something. And he said comparatively it was a very smooth engine, because of course as you shorten the stroke, you are reducing piston velocity and primary shaking force.
Yeah, the very late Manxes were the so-called short stroke ones.
They had to depart from the 5-piece crankshaft because they found that they couldn't, the crank pin would intrude on the main shaft. So on one side, the crank pin was made integral with the flywheel, and so they only had the one press fit. But in 1961, when Mike Halewood won the last TT to be won by a Manx Norton powered bike, his bike had a 1-piece crankshaft machined from solid, and it had a Jaguar plain bearing connecting rod. The reason being that starting in the late 50s sometime, crank pins would just break. And you couldn't say, oh, well, the crank pin's good for 15 hours. It would happen at random. So they decided, let's just forget this rolling element bearing business and modernize. So they made the 1-piece crank with a hefty crank pin with nice smooth fillets where it joined the cheeks. And those were reliable at higher revolutions. 1961, that was the last time a Manx won the Isle of Man. And it happened because the throttle sticking on the MV, which had led.
Well, we'll take it, right? Win's a win.
For sure.
Got to get there. 100% doesn't make the grid. And then how do you get to the finish line?
Yep.
I think the press together crank is just is a funny piece of history, because RD 350, XS 650, roller bearings, Suzuki GS 1000s, roller bearings and stuff. It's just crazy that it went on that long, but it was, it was working fine. I mean, I think for me, the hilarity for the 350, the RD 350 was when we did my RD 350 engine in your shop, and we had kind of a miscommunication about. Well, we were thinking of the same thing, except the picture of what we were thinking was completely different. And I said, "Oh, mid-range motor," and you said, "Oh yeah, mid-range motor." And your idea of mid-range as a race tuner on a 350 two-stroke twin was different than mine as a street guy who had ridden this bike for many thousands of miles on the street. And so you went over into the corner and you were all porting away, doing your thing, and I was over cleaning the case halves and wiping off old 3-bond, which you thank God you told me it would wipe off with lacquer thinner, because I was over there trying to scrape it, and you're like, anyway, I'm doing all of that, and you're going grinding away, and I said, yeah, so torque, and you're like, yeah, torque, and then I say, so like, what are we looking at? Like 3 to 7, 3 to 6, because the red line I think is 9 on those factory red line on RD 350 is 9,000, and I said, 3 to 7, and you looked at me and said 3.
Yeah.
And you're like, no, it's going to make torque from, I think you said 7 to 11.
7 to something, yeah.
Yeah, or 7, 10, whatever you said. But it was over the factory red line. And just casually you say, yeah, you're going to have to do something about the, the charging ignition and all that, because it walks off the crank at higher RPM.
Yeah,
that's pressed together.
The ignition side flywheel walks off the crank pin, yeah.
Yeah, and that's pressed together. Like it can work really fine up to a point until it doesn't, and either the pin, the pin's under a tremendous amount of stress. The flywheel's under
and the flywheel, the crank pin. This will be the crank pin joining the two flywheels, and the flywheels are doing this.
Yeah,
and that means that there's continuous slight motion in the press fit. That's why when you press it apart, the parts have a reddish color.
Yeah, red fretting.
Yeah, that's iron oxide, aka rust.
You can see that on if you go up to some of the vintage aircraft that I hang around with. The props are held on with a spline, a very large spline, square edge spline, and you can see red fretting. And what's interesting about that is if you look at one of these big splines, there'll be red fretting in an area over here, but not over here. And I'm thinking like, well, this is the engine having a vibration that causes something that seems to be located in that area, but not somewhere else.
Or propellers doing something.
Yeah, or they didn't, I don't know, lubricate it.
Up here at the local FBO, there was a little motor glider outfit that was just about to try to launch their stock on the stock exchange. And they had this weird vibration. They're using plastic propellers, and they weren't getting anywhere. And they brought in a French guy who was a vibration specialist. And he said, put a 3-blade on it and you'll be fine. And they did, and it just settled right down. So when the R2600 was put into, entered the war, it was, of course, always with metal propellers. And the prop mounts on mounting cones and is driven by the spline. So when they would take the prop off for service, they would look at these mounting cones and they're covered with fretting or welding and seizing, because the crankshaft is not rotating smoothly. It's kind of going did it, and the prop blades are waving around out there, and chunks of prop blade could develop a crack somewhere where the bending moment was considerable, and a piece would ultimately fly off. There was that case of a Constellation in 1948 on a flight to Miami. A piece of prop came through the fuselage, killed somebody. That's another case of the no-fly zone. There were certain RPM, engine RPM, that were not to be used. You can pass through it, but do it quickly. And in pre-war submarines, before they decided to solve the problem with diesel-electric drive, they broke a lot of crankshafts. The crankshafts, of course, were a mile long, and they could put the MIT torsiometer on there and measure. It would draw out all the peaks and valleys, and they would say, "Okay, this is a forbidden zone, and this and this," and it was driving engineers crazy. So they decided we'll run the engine at constant speed, the safest possible zone where the crankshaft is just lying there rotating, and we'll vary the propeller speed by driving it through electric motor. And that worked very well. Diesel electric. Same thing with locomotives. Locomotive engine and a submarine engine were very close for a long time in their design.
Somebody out there is doing a pickup truck. I think they've got a prototype for basically a diesel electric, so that you can have a very efficient generation of power, and then the power comes out through electric motors.
Yeah. Well, the electric motor has a torque characteristic that all of our cleverest engineers have devoted themselves to making IC engines act like an electric motor. And I'm not pushing for electric motors. I'm just pointing out that they have an excellent torque characteristic, provided that you have a convenient source of electric power to run them.
Yeah.
So
looking for the most convenient source for that. Well, that's Norton Commando, folks. Anyway, or not Norton Commando. That's Norton, and we'll wrap it up here. But hope you enjoyed the tour. We've got a lot of topics into the broad, Norton topic. A lot of combustion chamber and valve angles, all the stuff that matters. It's all we've ever been trying to do is broaden the torque curve, make the running as near perfect as it possibly can be. Such satisfaction where the cycle-to-cycle variation is nil or close to it.
Yes.
That means smoothness. It just means every combustion event is the same, which is sort of something we've always been striving for, and to some degree we've achieved. It's what I try to do with all my old junk. How do we walk out to our 1972 Yamaha XS 650, turn on the fuel taps, hit the choke, and kick it one time to start.
Dum, 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 dum. Yes.
Yeah, you try to achieve all that. It's good times. Thank you for listening. We will catch you on the next one.